The bank sent 3 people that morning. One carried the notice, one changed the locks, and one stood there to make sure nothing became a problem. They pulled into the driveway just after 9 a.m. The farmer was already outside, waiting. He watched the county representative unfold the paper, watched the locksmith carry a new padlock toward the porch, watched the banker step out of the car, like this was just another stop in a long week. Nobody argued. Nobody needed to. The notice went onto the front door first, bright red letters, sealed by county order. The old lock came off less than a minute later. Metal hit the porch wood with a sharp crack. The new padlock snapped shut right after it. Quick, clean, practiced. The banker stayed near the car the whole time with his arms crossed, barely paying attention anymore. The farmer finally walked toward the porch, not to argue, just to see it up close. He stopped in front of the notice and read it quietly. Then he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small brass key, old enough that the edges had gone smooth. He looked at it for a few seconds, then slipped it back into his pocket. The banker noticed. He glanced at the key once, then looked away like it didn't matter, said something to the county representative. Both men smiled, the kind of smile people give when they think the story is already finished. A minute later, the car disappeared down the gravel road, dust hanging behind it. The farmer stayed there a little longer, looking at the new lock, looking at the sealed notice. Then he turned around, walked to his truck, and started the engine. A few seconds later, he drove away from the farm, not toward the bank, toward the county road. His name was Roy Callaway, 71 years old. His family had been on that land since 1931. His grandfather cleared the first field by hand. His father kept the farm alive through drought years and flood years, and when his father's body finally gave out in the late 1980s, Roy took over without ever really being asked. On that land, it was never a question. There had been 3 farms once. One got sold in the mid-1970s after his grandmother spent 8 months in the hospital following a stroke. Another disappeared after the Mississippi floods of 1993 wiped out 2 harvests back to back. This one was the last, and Roy had held on to it longer than anyone expected. In 2019, he took a loan against the property to replace old equipment after the combine finally died. For 3 years, he made every payment on time. Then came a late frost. Then a dry summer. The harvest collapsed. Roy missed a payment. Then another. He called the bank asking for more time. The bank said they would review it. 11 months later, they filed foreclosure papers instead. Roy had seen it coming long before that morning. Not suddenly. Slowly. Like weather building out in the distance. And sometime during those months he had gone into his grandfather's old workshop and taken a brass key down from a wooden peg near the door. The same brass key he carried now. He had been carrying it ever since. The attorney's name was Paul Greer. Small office off the county road. 1 assistant, 2 filing cabinets, a desk covered in paperwork. Roy had called him before the bank even arrived that morning. By the time the notice was hanging on the farmhouse door, Paul already had old county records open on his computer. Roy walked into the office a little after 10, sat down across from the desk, reached into his coat pocket, and placed the brass key between them. Paul looked at it for a second. "What does it open?" Roy answered quietly. "A water gate, about 3 miles east of my land. My grandfather helped build it in 1931. Paul frowned slightly. "And that connects to this foreclosure. How?" Roy nodded toward the computer. Pull the 1931 County Water Agreement first. Paul turned toward the screen, typed for a few seconds, waited for the records to load, then started reading. Only the keyboard clicks broke the silence. Roy didn't interrupt him, didn't explain anything else. He just sat there watching Paul read line after line. Almost 2 minutes passed before Paul finally leaned back in his chair. His expression had changed. Not shocked, careful. The kind of careful that comes right before somebody realizes a situation is bigger than it looked 5 minutes earlier. Paul looked back at Roy. "How long have you known about this agreement?" "My whole life," Roy said. "My grandfather showed it to me when I was 12. My father reminded me about it when he handed me the farm." "And you never used it?" Roy shook his head once. "Never needed to." Paul looked down at the brass key again, then back at the county records on the screen. "The bank has no idea this exists," he said. "No," Roy replied. "They don't." Paul stayed quiet for a moment longer. Then he reached for a pen and pulled a legal pad closer. "Give me 2 hours." Roy stood up, picked up the key, slipped it back into his coat pocket. "I'll be at the diner on Route 9, he said. Then he walked out of the office, before the front door had even closed behind him. Paul was already reaching for the phone. Something had shifted in that room. Roy had walked in looking like a man who had just lost his farm. He didn't walk out looking beaten anymore. The banker's name was Greg Hollins, 14 years at the bank, regional foreclosure manager for the last 6. By noon, the Callaway file had already been moved into the closed column on his desk. As far as Greg Hollins was concerned, the situation was finished. That afternoon, he met the developer at the property, Dennis Pruitt, local contractor, storage buildings, equipment yards, the kind of projects that stayed practical and made money quietly. They walked the land together just after 2 p.m. Pruitt looked over the fields, the farmhouse sitting near the tree line. He asked about road access, utility lines, drainage. Then he asked one more question. "How's water handled out here?" Hollins answered immediately. "County connection. Standard setup." He answered like he'd never had a reason to doubt it. Pruitt nodded anyway and wrote something down in his notebook. A few minutes later, they shook hands beside the gate. On the drive back, Hollins found himself thinking about the farmer again. Mostly the key. The way Roy had looked at it, standing in front of the sealed door. He mentioned it to his assistant later that afternoon. "Some of the older ones don't take it well," he said. "They always think they've got one last thing that changes everything." The assistant looked up from her desk. "What was the key for?" Hollins shrugged. "Probably nothing." Then he slid the Callaway file into a cabinet drawer, closed it, and moved on to the next property. 3 miles away, Roy Callaway was finishing his second cup of coffee at the diner on Route 9. His phone buzzed against the table. Paul Greer. Roy answered, listened quietly for less than 30 seconds. Then he hung up, left a $10 bill beside the empty cup, and walked outside. A few moments later, his truck pulled back onto the county road, heading toward Paul's office. And for the first time that day, Roy didn't look like a man trying to hold on to something. He looked like a man waiting for someone else to realize a mistake. Paul had printed 3 documents. He laid them across the desk one by one, then looked at Roy. "I'm going to walk through this carefully," he said, "because if I'm reading it right, the bank missed something important." Roy sat down across from him, waited. Paul pointed to the first document. 1931. Your grandfather and 2 neighboring farmers signed a county water management agreement. They helped build a small irrigation channel running off the creek south of your land." Roy nodded once. Paul continued. "As part of that agreement, your family was given permanent operational control over the main water gate." He tapped the paper lightly. "Permanent is written here 4 different times." Then he pulled the second document closer. "The gate itself isn't on your property," he said. "It's about 3 miles north on county-adjacent land. Your family kept legal access to it through the original agreement." Roy looked at the brass key in his hand. "My father took me there every spring," he said quietly. "Showed me how to work the gate." Paul nodded. "Now here's the part that matters." He leaned back slightly. "When the bank approved your 2019 loan, they ran a standard title search. They checked the farm boundaries, buildings, creek access, everything directly attached to the property." Paul looked down at the documents again. "But not the gate," Roy finally spoke, "because it was never part of the property." "Exactly." Paul set his pen down. "The gate was never included in the farm's legal description, which means it was never part of the loan collateral." He paused for a second. "Which means the foreclosure never touched it." The room went quiet. Then Paul said it plainly. "They took the land." He glanced at the brass key. "But they didn't take the water." Roy looked down at the key resting in his palm. Same brass key his grandfather had used. Same one his father handed him years earlier with only one instruction: keep it safe. Roy had carried it for months now, not because he planned to use it, because somewhere deep down, he thought he might have to. Paul flipped to the third document. "The real question now," he said, "is who depends on that gate downstream." Roy looked up. "And if they know the gate still belongs to me?" Paul gave a slow nod. "No," he said. "They will soon." Paul filed the form at 3:47 p.m. 1 page, County Water Authority. The clerk stamped it without even looking up. The county system processed it overnight. By Wednesday morning, 5 notification letters had been generated, and 1 automatic permit hold. Dennis Pruitt got the notice Thursday morning. He called the county office immediately. An upstream water gate connected to nearby agricultural permits was under legal review. His commercial permit application had been placed on hold. "How long?" he asked. 60 days minimum." Pruitt hung up and called the bank. Greg Hollins answered from his office. Pruitt explained the situation. Hollins frowned. "What water gate?" "That's what I'm asking you." Hollins pulled the Callaway file back out of the cabinet, opened the title search, farm boundaries, outbuildings, creek access, but nothing about a gate, nothing about a 1931 agreement. He called the title company. "Anything before 1970 requires an extended search," the woman told him. "How long?" "A few days." "Run it." After the call ended, Holland sat quietly staring at the file. Then he thought about the old farmer standing in the driveway. The brass key. The way Roy had looked at it before putting it back into his pocket. Roy was sitting at his kitchen table when the phone rang. First Consolidated Rural Bank. Over the past year he had called them dozens of times. Waited on hold. Now they were calling him. Roy answered on the third ring. "Roy Callaway." The voice on the other end sounded careful this time. "Mr. Callaway," Greg Hollins said. "I was hoping we could talk." Roy leaned back in his chair. Outside, the sprinkler lines were already running across the lower field. "I'm listening," he said. The meeting happened at the county offices, not the bank, not a courtroom, just a plain room with a table and 4 chairs. Roy on one side, Paul beside him, Hollins across from them with the bank attorney. No audience, no speeches. Hollins opened the file first, said the bank was prepared to discuss a resolution. Paul nodded once. Good. Hollins said the Watergate review had created a serious problem with the pending sale. Paul replied calmly. It's not a problem. It's a property right that predates your loan by 88 years. Hollins didn't argue. His attorney had already explained that part to him. The negotiation moved quickly after that. The bank needed the developer to close. The developer needed his permits approved, and the permits wouldn't move forward while the water review remained active. Paul slid the proposal across the table. 3 points: reduced loan balance, a new payment schedule Roy could realistically meet, and full retention of the Callaway family's water rights under the 1931 agreement. In exchange, Roy would withdraw the county review request. The gate would remain open. The permits would move again. The sale would continue. Hollins read the proposal carefully, spoke quietly with the attorney beside him, then looked directly at Roy for the first time since the meeting began. The reduction is difficult to justify internally. Paul answered immediately. Your title search missed an 88-year-old county agreement. That's the justification. Silence for a few seconds. Then Hollins picked up his pen, signed. Roy signed after him, slowly, line by line, the same way his father had taught him years earlier. Then he stood up, shook Paul's hand, picked up his coat, and walked out. The sealed notice came off the farmhouse door the following Friday. Same county representative who had posted it 3 weeks earlier. He removed the notice, unlocked the padlock, loaded both into the truck, then drove away. Roy stood alone on the porch for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the brass key, still smooth around the edges from decades of use. He walked around to the old workshop behind the house, small wooden pegboard on the wall, hooks for tools, keys, things meant to stay where they belonged. Roy hung the Watergate key back on the 3rd hook from the left, same place it had hung for decades. Then he went back inside, put the kettle on, and sat quietly at the kitchen table. Outside, water moved slowly through the southern channel beside the field. Still running, still his. Not because of luck, not because of a miracle, because in 1931 a man had done careful work, and in 2024 his grandson remembered it. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe. New stories every week. Next week, a bank bought an abandoned ranch at auction. Then someone found the original survey map